So I have a few thoughts about the affirmative, but I want to start this video talking about the negative. And one thing that I'm a big believer in doing at the beginning of the year when a topic is still relatively new is you come up with your broad spectrum strategy and you try as much as you can to make it like a funnel. You try to think of something that's going to cover almost all your bases. And then, after you've got that pretty solid, that's when you try to figure out what the biggest, most popular affirmatives are going to be, and you do case-specific work. And that goes on for the rest of the year. Once you find out what people actually are running, and then you find out what are people actually winning with, and you get to each of those cases and you do your case hit. But you've still got that funnel from the beginning of the year to cover almost everything else that you haven't quite gotten to with specifics just yet. One year, our topic was that the commander-in-chief power of the United States president should be curtailed. And so what we did at the beginning of the year is we wrote a topicality argument that this can only be done by constitutional amendment because the commander-in-chief power is one of the inherent powers given to the president in the text of the Constitution. So then we wrote a series of disadvantages and a counterplan and a whole strategy around why doing it by constitutional amendment is actually a really bad idea, and there are other ways of doing it that aren't nearly as damaging. So if they didn't do it by constitutional amendment, we had the topicality argument. And if they did do it by constitutional amendment, we had the other parts of the strategy. And we didn't use that every round, but we had it available for the little corners of the topic we hadn't gotten to quite yet. So I got to thinking, and I think that there is kind of a funnel strategy, and I think that it's got two parts to it. I think what you do is you make arguments about what will be the effect of the plan, perceived effect of the plan on the debt, on the United States debt, public debt, and what pressure will that impose or relieve on different actors that track the level of the debt. And I think one direction that this argument goes is the starve the beast argument. Starve the beast is something, it's sort of traceable back to something Grover Norquist has said about how he wants to see, through his lobbying about taxes, he wants to see the government shrunk down to where he can drown it in the bathtub. And so there are a lot of folks who say that the current big high-profile discussions over the deficit and the debt and the refusal to raise taxes and the insistence that the debt has to be brought down with nothing but spending cuts, that really there's a broader philosophical agenda there, and what it's trying to do is it's trying to shrink the size of government. And I think you can harness this argument. I think you can say that that case has been made, and right now that leverage is successful, and about the only discussion that's happening, or at least the dominant discussion that's happening, of how to bring the debt down is by shrinking the size of government. So you say, the pressure is in place, this is an opportunity we will not get again. And so therefore, if the affirmative, either by being more efficient in tax collection or by raising taxes on some commodity, raising tariffs, doing anything like that, if they bring in fresh revenue, then that takes the pressure off. And you could say, I think, if you dig around in the literature that defends this, that even minor relief of the pressure, even minor new sources of incoming revenue can actually, because this is symbolic in nature, can actually change the way the game is being played altogether. And you could say this is the best chance we will have in this generation to actually shrink the size of the federal government. Now where you go from there is you go to, you make arguments about the size of government and what implication that has for how powerful government is. And you'll find that there are plenty of libertarian and conservative political commentators who write about this. There's a 2006 book by an author by the name of Joel Miller, and I want to say that the name of the book is Size Matters. And he makes exactly that argument. Says the bigger government is, the more power it has, the more our freedoms are endangered. And where I think you go with that to get even a little bit extra impact, and I think I've recommended this author to you in the past, an author by the name of Rudolph J. Rummel, who's an emeritus professor of political science at the University of Hawaii, because in a series of books over the years, he's made the argument that there is a direct line connection between how powerful a government is and how likely it is to kill its own or other citizens. The idea that more powerful governments result in a perfect relationship, perfect curvilinear relationship in a lot of dead bodies. So I think you could say that it's important that there be nothing perceptually relieving the pressure to shrink the United States government, because the United States government, the more tyrannical it gets, the more endangered we all are. And I think along the way, while you're in the conservative and libertarian literature that would make the argument about how the size of government corresponds to its tendency to encroach on freedom, I think you'd find other impacts as well. But I think that that's the argument that the debt is shrinking government. It's putting pressure. Politicians can't grow the government anymore because of the debt. So it's really important that absolutely nothing passed through the government that would make it appear as though the debt was being shrunk by the introduction of new revenue. I think that's one direction the argument can go. Now, the other direction the argument goes is investors watching the United States and how the United States currency has been sort of the shelter currency, but there have been the warning shots recently from Moody's and from other agencies saying that they're going to demote the rating of our securities. We're not going to be a AAA security anymore, and that's chiefly because of the debt ballooning out of control. It's also because of the discussions over the debt ceiling and the possibility of default, but you can find evidence if you go digging a little bit that if there are signs that the debt continues to grow, if there are even little signs now that the profile of the issue has been raised, then the United States could lose its rating, and then a lot of people who've only invested in the United States because it was a shelter, because it was the most reliable place for them to store a lot of their assets, then they'll simply dump them. And I think the way you can impact that, you could impact that in a United States economic collapse. And for your parent judges, that might be enough to say, wouldn't it be terrible if the United States economy collapsed? But then I think you can go on a little further and you can talk about U.S. leadership and about how you can dig up evidence to talk about U.S. leadership and about how it's not so much the case that other nations around the world follow our lead just because of our values, just because they aspire to be like us, because there are a lot of little tiny nations around the world that have a very good human rights record, that they're very much admired in how they handle matters of public controversy that come up involving their citizens. But the fact that they're tiny, and the fact that they're not very affluent, they're not really the world's model as to how you take these values and you become a thriving nation. And you become a nation that raises its own standard of living and the standard of living of the rest of the world as well. That's the source of our leadership. And in the collapse of our leadership, you can make all kinds of arguments about how little regional arms races and so forth around the world are likely to spiral out of control. You'll find just a burgeoning literature as to what kinds of bad things happen when the United States leadership collapses. Now, one argument you're going to have to deal with is that the collapse of United States leadership is on the way. You've got Fareed Zakaria talking about the post-American world, that the rest of the world is catching up with us. So if you want to win that impact, you're going to have to win that even if other nations are becoming sort of combined, they're becoming a critical mass that can counterbalance us, it's still the case that as long as we are the biggest part of the economic engine, that we hold on to our leadership. So I don't think that the uniqueness angle on the impact of that argument is necessarily fatal. I think with a little clever research that you can be just fine on that. So to kind of sum up that argument, reducing the debt is a bad thing because reducing the debt removes the pressure to shrink government. The government's currently too big. The larger a government is, the more it encroaches on people's freedoms, the more likely it is to become violent. So therefore, if you can explain how the plan in any way at all brings in new revenue and therefore makes it look as though the pressure is coming off the debt problem, that's bad. That ensures the government will remain big. On the other hand, if the affirmative goes the other direction, if it seems as though they are, they're cutting taxes, they're doing something like that that makes it seem as though the debt is going to continue to swell and it's not being addressed, then you could say that raises the likelihood that our bond rating is going to be demoted, and possibly even independently of that investors will just decide as they see the debt getting bigger that it's not worth it, that the debt ceiling fight is going to happen again, that sooner or later they're going to be caught with a bunch of American securities that really aren't worth what they need to be worth for them to be a safe place to park their assets. And then you can win the economic repercussions of that and possibly the U.S. leadership repercussions of that as well. I think if you went out and do the research to put both those arguments together, that you could find a way to explain for just about any affirmative on the topic, either perceptually they will relieve the pressure on the debt, or perceptually they'll drive it up. You might have to be a little bit clever in how you do so. There might be some process affirmatives, they don't really seem to move the debt either direction. But it's a lot easier if you've got a generic like that that's very well developed and you've got a number of rounds experience going for it, to then go out and find specific link evidence for affirmatives, and that can be a stopgap measure. In a week between tournaments when you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of research, you can just go and find link cards to that. And then later on, when you have more time, you can do a more detailed case hit to try to get it together for one of those corners of the topic you didn't quite get to. So a couple of other things. I talked about this a little bit in the previous video, I think I did anyway, but I think in talking about the whole business confidence, investor confidence thing, I think if you go with search terms like tax reform and planning, tax reform and uncertainty, I think you can find a fairly healthy literature. I've seen a couple of these articles talking about how businesses make long-term plans and investors make long-term plans, and they factor into it the tax code as it is, and that every time there's been major tax reform in the past, there's been this period where people have had to figure out what does this mean, and they've had to overhaul their entire business or investment strategy. So I think that you could put together a nice little argument whose link was just uncertainty, just making things different. Now, similar to that, I think that there's a good little utility argument, a utility solvency argument that you could get a lot of mileage out of this year, is the whole industry that exists in finding tax loopholes, in finding tax shelters, and those are your search terms: tax loopholes, tax shelters. And it'd be a little bit of a history lesson because you'd go back to the 1986 tax reform bill, the 1976 one, the 1969 one, and what you would find is there are authors who say every single purpose that the authors of those legislation, that the sponsors of those legislation set out to achieve, there are tax attorneys and there are investment planners who found a way, by hiding money offshore, by, tax shelters of various kinds, they found a way to subvert it. And so you could have a nice little circumvention argument that even when you have nothing else to say about an affirmative, you could say whatever pressure you're trying to exert with this reform in tax policy, assuming that these are tax policies and not other corners of revenue generation that people are dealing with, that there are a lot of people who will find a way to put their money someplace to where you don't achieve your purpose. I think that's an argument that would be very useful throughout the year. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about the affirmative. And I'm seeing a whole lot written about different approaches to enforcing tax law that are meant to cultivate in the attitudes of the taxpayer a greater willingness to actually pay. And it reminds me of the trend, and I think this is 20 or 30 years in the past, to shift how police carry out their duties, the movement toward community policing. The idea that you don't sit in the police station until someone commits a crime, then you hop in your car, you go out, you slap the cuffs on them and put them in jail. But what police officers should do is they should go out into the community, be visible, build relationships with people, and thereby knit together a group of people who think this is our neighborhood, this is our town. We do not commit crimes and we do not tolerate people who do. And when the police show up because a crime is suspected, these police are people that we know. They are part of our community, therefore we work with them, not against them. It seems as though there are a lot of people writing about tax enforcement in a very similar way. And particularly around 2009, there were a number of fairly developed journal articles produced that talked about approaches that could work in the United States to foster kind of this spirit of paying taxes is just part of it, and avoiding the tax burden by being creative with deployment of assets is in some way, it's in some way not living up to your obligations. If you're interested in pursuing this, if you're interested in writing an affirmative that's about smarter tax collection, that's less oppositional, the place I think I'd start with, if I were you, is I would start with the University of Michigan Journal of Law Reform. In the winter 2009 issue, there's an article by a guy, I'm going to mispronounce his name, named Sagit Leviner or Leviner. It's Leviner. And what he does is he talks about one of these approaches, calls it responsive regulation, and has a couple of other titles for it. But he talks about how it's worked in Australia, and that's a really good thing to have, an example of where your plan has been done. And in particular, Australia is, culturally, it's somewhat different from the United States, but not hugely so. And some of the cultural differences actually help you, because Australia is, if anything, even more individualistic than the United States. And so if they're complying, if they're feeling kind of the collective burden to chip in and contribute to the maintenance of the government, you might be able to say, hey, if it worked there, it'll work twice as well here, because we're more likely to have a communitarian spirit than the typical Australian. Now, one of the things in sort of noticing all of this, I saw this very interesting article, and it was in Law and Social Inquiry in the summer 2007 issue. The title of the article is Training in Citizenship, Tax Compliance, and Modernity, and I'm really going to mispronounce this author's name, Asaf Likovsky. What he did is he talked through, he or she, I really don't know, the author talked through the experiences of Israel almost right after the nation was reformed in 1948, and some ways that they tried to do exactly this, that they tried to instill a spirit of paying taxes as patriotic. And the author makes some really wonderfully dark comments about how this is mind control, and about how, you know, when you write your laws, certainly you can take reasonable procedural steps to see that the terms of the law are obeyed, but trying to reprogram your citizens to where they feel cheerful and enthusiastic about the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law, is, in some ways, he draws a parallel between it and Nazi Germany. So if that becomes, if these other affirmatives that I've been describing for the past couple of minutes, if those become kind of a popular strategy, you might want to go back and get that article, because that could be a funky little critique for you to argue against those affirmatives. The one last thing that I'll throw out, just because I found this entertaining, there's a surprising amount written about a ruling, and it's not limited to tax law. It actually spreads across a lot of different areas of employment law. The Antarctic is not considered a foreign country. And it's not considered a foreign country because who's the government of it? The implication for tax law is if you're working in a foreign country, then your tax burden is completely different. But workers who work, for example, for Raytheon has a number of people on bases in Antarctica, and they get bills from the IRS that they need to pay their American taxes. And it comes as a surprise to a lot of them, because these are people who in their careers have been moved around the world to different places, and they calculate the tax burden completely differently, and then they get put in Antarctica and they pretty much have to file a 1040. And a lot of people have challenged it, and the courts keep upholding the IRS. So one potential affirmative could be for you to change that to where we would no longer collect taxes. And you might be able to, if you go digging, you might be able to find evidence that said that we should treat Antarctica as though it's a foreign country, even though it's not a foreign sovereignty, because there are a lot of other ways in which employees who are in Antarctica are not treated very well. I mean, a lot of the wrongful death type things, there have been a lot of cases, because Antarctica is kind of a dangerous place to work, and there have been a lot of people injured and even killed there. But because it's in that kind of legal limbo, you can find some horror stories of people really not being able to get redress in those situations. So you might go looking for, the search terms would be Raytheon and Antarctica and the IRS, and you might wind up with an amusing little affirmative that's off in one corner of the topic. So those are my latest ideas, and as I get more ideas, I'll be back with more videos, and we will see if this helps you have some interesting debates this year.